women will live about 7 years longer than men. So it could be the case that the societal norm could be that women have their children when they're quite young and then go back to school in their 30s. That would actually work out. In principle, that could work out quite nicely, but we don't have the norms in place to make that a possibility.
Explore the psychology behind societal influences on women's choices. Bernt Peterson delves into the impact of biology, culture, and ideology.
You know that wages have been flat, except in the upper 1% since 1973. Why? Well, it's easy. What happens when you double the labor force? What happens? You have the value of labor. So now we're in a situation where it takes 2 people to make as much as 1 did before. So we went from a situation where women's career opportunities were relatively limited to where they were relatively unlimited and there were 2 incomes to where, and so women could work, to a situation where women have to work and they only make half as much as they would have otherwise. And now we're going to go into a situation, this is the next step, whereas women will work because men won't. And that's what's coming now. So there was an economist article showing that 50% now of boys in school are having trouble with their basic subjects. And you look around you in universities, you can see this happening. I've watched it over decades. I would say 90% of the people in my personality class are now women. There won't be a damn man left in university in 10 years, except in the STEM fields. And it's a complete bloody catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe for women because I don't know where the hell you're going to find someone to have to marry and have a family with if this keeps happening.
Bernt Peterson discusses how biology influences men and women's career choices, addressing societal misconceptions about gender roles. The conversation navigates through ideological perspectives and the implications of the Me Too movement.
We always lie to young women about what's going to be important in their lives. We tell them it's going to be all career. Said, I've worked in female-dominated industries my whole life, and what I've observed is, among men and women alike, that it's a very rare person for whom career is the most important thing in their life, even if they're men, although it's true for more men. It's true for virtually no women by the time they hit 30. And the amount of vitriol that comment generated was unparalleled. And that's something, because I've had plenty of vitriol generated from things I said, but it was all young women, talking about how some old white guy like me had no right to tell young women what to do with their bodies, which I most certainly was not. But it is, you can see a simple pathway there, right? It's like, well, we have this avenue where we can pursue our career and our education and everything else we want, and then we'll be able to solve the problem of having a family. The problem with that is, well, it's hard enough to find a mate when you're 23, 24. By the time you're 30, it's even more difficult, and by the time you're 35, it's starting to become well nigh impossible to find a mate and get pregnant and have a family, especially if you're going to have more than one kid. And so there's a direct conflict there between the avenues that are open to women and the need to strike while the iron's hot on the reproductive front. Nobody really knows how to reconcile that.
Boys and girls are different. Men and women are different. It looks biological, but because people are malleable, you could push the socio-cultural structure harder and harder to minimize the biological differences. Okay, well, first of all, maybe and maybe not. Maybe you'd get a rebound and they'd get even, like, the kids would rebel. That could easily happen. But let's say, okay, you could. The problem with that is that if you cede that much power to the state, like, you're basically giving the state the right to socialize your kids.
Right.
It's like, you really? Really? You really want to do that? I mean, the people in Israel couldn't do that with the kibbutzes, right? It didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So people aren't going to give up their children to the state, and thank God for that.
When I point out that the feminine is symbolized by chaos, well, in their case, it's certainly acting as chaos. And the other thing I should also insist upon is that I don't draw a moral distinction with regards to the utility of order versus chaos. Order is the domain of what we have comprehended and control. And we certainly want to comprehend things and control them because we want things to turn out the way we want them to turn out. And that's the definition of control. But chaos is the domain that surrounds that, from which all new things flow, which is also part of the reason that it's feminine, because the feminine is that from which all new things flow, as well as that which rejects the order and selects. These are very deep issues. They're very fundamental issues. I mean, do your feminist friends also doubt the reality of hypergamy? Because that's the proclivity of women to mate at or up or across or up hierarchies of socioeconomic status. It's been well documented across many, many cultures, although it is ameliorated to some degree in the most egalitarian cultures, as opposed to being exaggerated as personality traits are in those. The difference between men and women, personality is exaggerated in those cultures. Hypergamy is also an indication of the feminine's tendency to reject the current embodiment of order in the form of the masculine entities that present themselves to her, let's say. So I don't think your feminist friends have a leg to stand on with regards to the criticism. I just think they want to have their cake and eat it too, and they haven't read the relevant books, and they like to say things they haven't thought through, and they want, and it's an easy way of dismissing my ideas, and they don't know what they're throwing away when they throw away the feminine identification with chaos and plenitude and generation and creativity and all of that, because somehow they think it's an insult, because they don't understand anything about what I'm saying and don't want to.
Peterson elaborates on the significance of birth control in revolutionizing human interactions. He emphasizes the need to find a balance between empowerment, boundaries, and behavioral expectations in the Me Too era. The discussion highlights the complexities of human sexuality and its evolution over time.
We've got things backwards in our culture. We're thinking, at least in part, why aren't there more women in positions of power? Wrong question. The right question is, why are there any men at all who want those positions of power? Because it's not just positions of power. You have to be such a knothead to think that. Oh, it's a position of power. It's like, sure, but it's a position of overwhelming responsibility. And if you make mistakes, you're done, right? It's not like you occupy that position of power and everyone does what they're told all the time and your life is easy. It's like, forget about that. People are on your case to do exactly the right thing all the time, 100% of the time. And maybe you want that and maybe you don't. So I don't know what people think is these people are all sitting in their offices with their feet up on the desk, smoking cigars and oppressing the world. It's like, that isn't how it works. Those people, they work flat out all the time. So, and it's fine if that's what you want, and some people are like that. They're hyper-industrious people, right? From a trait perspective, no matter where you put them. If you put them in a forest with an axe, they just wander around chopping down trees nonstop, right? Because it's built into them. But if you want to have a balanced life, and you should want that, because the other thing you'll find, and this is God's gospel truth, is that the older you get, if you have any sense at all, the more important your family is to you. Like the utility of your career, maybe that peaks around 35 or 40, and it starts to decline pretty rapidly after that. And what happens, if you're fortunate, you have someone in your life that you love, that you've woven yourself together with, and you have some kids so that you have something to do from the time you're 50 till the time you're 80. And so it's a real mistake. It's a barren future without children, man. I can tell you that. It's a real mistake. And so we do a terrible job of say, putting that image forward and saying, well, yeah, now, because women have access to the birth control pill now and can compete in the same domains as men, roughly speaking, there is a real practical problem here. It's partly an economic problem now, because when I was roughly your age, it was still possible for a one-income family to exist when you're 19, because you're so clueless when you're 19, you don't know a bloody thing. You think, well, I'm not really sure I want children anyways. It's like, oh yeah, you tell how well you've been educated. Jesus, dismal. Without fail, I gotta tell you, without fail, I've watched women go through their professional careers, many, many of them. It's a very rare woman who at the age of 30 doesn't consider having a child her primary desire. And the ones that don't consider that, generally, in my observation, there's something that isn't quite right in the way that they're constituted or looking at the world. Sometimes you get women who are truly non-maternal, by temperament. They have a masculine temperament, disagreeable. They're not particularly compassionate. They're not maternal. They're not that interested in kids. Fair enough, man. But there aren't that many of them, and there's plenty who will not admit to themselves that that's what they most desperately want.
1 in 3 couples by the age of 30 have pronounced fertility problems, defined as inability to conceive within a year of embarking on the endeavor consciously, right? So that's 1 in 3. And of course, it just gets worse and worse as age creeps up. And 30 is not that old. And it does mean that women have a damn tight window. It's 13 years, let's say, by the time you're 17. By some standards, you're mature enough to consider reproduction. 17 or 18, and on the extreme end, and then, well, 35 is the other end of that distribution, and you're playing with fire by the time you're delaying, especially if you don't have a partner, by the time you're delaying till 35.
Especially if you want 3 children.
Yeah, well, right. I'm thinking just 1, and it's also the case. I think if you're a reasonable observer of human nature, you see that people have 3 sources of fundamental gratification in their lives. One is the pursuit of their own interests, including career and job. One is their intimate relationship, and the other is their family. And obviously, the intimate relationship and the family are very integrally associated. And if you miss out on one of those, you may be able to fill it by exceptional ability in the remaining domains. But for most people, not only is that highly unlikely, it's also highly undesirable. Yeah, it's very difficult for women to overcome the hypergamous instinct because they're trying to redress the imbalance in terms of reproductive responsibility. There's no evidence at all. You get a little bit of flattening of hypergamy in extremely egalitarian societies like Scandinavia, but it certainly doesn't disappear. And so that's built in at a very fundamental biological level. And I don't think any casual tinkering on the anthropological or sociological front is going to shift that a bit. So that's a big problem.
It's a big problem.
It's also the case, too, that if marriages where the wife out-earns or out-statuses the husband tend to be comparatively unstable and violent. So, now you can lay that at the feet of the man if you're inclined to, but in some sense it doesn't really matter because that's the way it is. And so the women are unhappy and the men are threatened, and that's just not a good recipe for marital stability.
As women get older, they get better at separating out the narcissists from the competent men. But initially, because the narcissists have this confidence that is a marker of competence, even though not an invariable marker, they can easily be fooled. Yeah, well, the gender issue is really an interesting one because one of my professional domains of expertise is individual differences. I'm a personality psychologist, and so I know the gender difference literature. And it's a very solid literature. Well, first of all, it's very solid. It has a 30-year history. One psychologist got the personality models down, so that would be the Big 5 model. All empirically derived, straight statistics, right? Brute force empiricism. Nobody had a theoretical axe to grind with the Big 5 except to say, maybe there are human traits, maybe they're encapsulated in language. We can use statistical techniques to find out what they are. That was it. That's the whole ideology. So very, very neutral as far as ideologies go. 5 traits emerge. Okay. Are there differences between the sexes? Turns out there are. All right, they're not massive, although if you sum them across all the traits, you can separate men and women with about 75% accuracy. So it's not trivial, but you have to sum across all the traits. Then another question comes up. Well, are those differences sociocultural or biological? Okay, we can test that. We'll go around the world, we'll look at cultures, we'll rank order them in terms of the gender equality of their sociological policies. We can do that with broad agreement from the right and the left. Then the hypothesis would be, if gender differences decrease among more egalitarian societies, then the gender differences are sociocultural, or at least more sociocultural. That's exactly the opposite of what was found repeatedly. That's pseudoscience. It's like, no, that's mainstream psychology. Those papers have thousands of citations, and the average humanities paper has 0 citations, right? And then the next most common one has 1. 3,000, that's an unbelievable classic. And here's the other bit of proof. Like you say, well, how do you know that you can trust someone's judgment about a fact? The fact emerges despite their ideological presuppositions. Okay, so it's well known that the social sciences and the humanities have a left tilt, and a lot of that's temperamental, and the tilt has become more pronounced. But as Jonathan Haidt has pointed out, there are no conservatives among social personality psychologists, or none to speak of.
Very few, yeah.
Very few. Vanishingly few. And if the field has a bias, it is definitely and indisputably a left-wing bias. Okay, so you have to fight that if you're a scientist, right? Even if you're a left-wing scientist, you have to fight that because you want to get to the facts. It was these social scientists who generated the data that suggested that the gender differences not only were real, but that were bigger in egalitarian societies. They didn't do that to grind their ideological axe, because their ideological presupposition was, no, you make the society egalitarian, men and women get more the same. It's like, nope, they get more different. Oh, isn't that something? And so then there's a corollary there, which is, all right, you could still say, and they're kind of pushing in this direction in Scandinavia,